All right, Sarah and Josh, thank you so much for joining us. We've been so looking forward to finally meeting you and having you on the podcast. So thanks so much for coming.
Yeah,
Excited
thank
to be
you
here.
so much. Happy to be here.
We have been enjoying this book in all of its forms. We've been reading it, we've been listening to it, and we're just so excited to hear about how the project came to be. And hopefully people will find out about it, because this is just has been so good for our family. Like, it's been such a new and fun way to re-engage with the Book of Mormon. So I would love to just hear about what inspired the project in the first place. And we know that you two are filmmakers. So if you want to talk about just what your vision was and how all of these creative gifts kind of flowed into this project, because I cannot imagine how huge of an undertaking it was to basically rewrite the Book of Mormon in short stories for children, like the entire book.
Yeah, I'll just say that we are filmmakers. We're screening a film at BYU tomorrow, which is exciting to be back there, because that's where we met. We met at BYU, but we actually met there as English majors. So I think before we were filmmakers, we were writers. And I think that's sort of at our core. We always want to write.
Yeah, and we started working on this book shortly after our oldest son was born. And we were just looking around for Book of Mormon resources for kids or for families. And most of what we found felt a little bit like flashcards, like this is who, this is what, this is where, this is when. And I think that stems from, a tendency that certainly I felt as a parent of like wanting your kids to know scripture stories because they're the scriptures. Yeah. And scriptures matter and are important. And so you should know these things because they're important. And there's nothing wrong with that approach. I think it's a great way to get like a bird's eye view of what's happening in the Book of Mormon. But I think that what it misses is that really the place kids are going to meet God is through stories. And they might care about stories because they're scriptures, but I think much more likely they'll care about them because they're good stories. And that's true of stories about Jesus. When you're at Christmas and you have all the decorations up and you're telling the story of the Christ child, it's an incredible story with amazing characters and a beautiful plot line. And it feels magical in part because the story is just really incredible. And that's true of the Book of Mormon too. I think you have really complex characters. You have epics, generational sagas, and poetry and literature, and it's beautiful. And I think when you capture some of that and when you tell those stories well, then suddenly the Book of Mormon is a place where parents and kids can actually see God at work in these stories, and can feel sort of a likening to the stories. These characters are like them, and where kids can start to relate to these stories in a much more intimate and profound way. And so that was our goal from the beginning. That's sort of where we started, and we wrote these over the course of a year, writing every Sunday during nap time for 2-hour increments. Yeah. And then we made the audiobook next, actually, and we recorded that like in our closet with clothes hanging around us to dampen the noise. Again, during nap time on Sundays. And so it was just sort of the slow labor of love.
That's amazing. I think you guys definitely achieved your goal. Can I ask you, when I first heard of this and I heard the words, the Book of Mormon Storybook, do you know what came to mind for me as like a early millennial?
Like
no,
1970s.
Exactly.
The 70s. What was that called?
The Book of Mormon
Reader? No.
It was like panel art. It was like
Book of Mormon Stories.
Book of Mormon Stories.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
To what extent did you guys feel like you were sort of juxtaposing with that? Did you know that would sort of be in people's minds when they heard Book of Mormon Storybook?
Yeah, I think we were definitely trying to sort of 2.0. I don't know. We're taking a very different approach than they took, obviously. Yeah. We weren't just trying to, like she talked about flashcards. I think that's a very good example of sort of like, oh, these are the basic stories and these are the characters and the events. But we were trying to tell stories and tell them powerfully. Yeah. And she mentioned, I think one of our goals was to be able to have parents and children read a story and both have a spiritual experience, right? Not just be like, we're supposed to know these things. Yeah. Or like the parent to be, and the kid to be bored, or or vice versa, or just like the kid enjoys it but the parent's bored. We're really trying to get that magic moment where both parents, children, and God are communing with it. And I think stories have the power to sort of do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that was really interesting for me is that you tell the story, but you're also, excuse me, you're extracting insights from the stories sort of as you go. It's not just the narrative story. And to some extent, that's you two doing your own work of translation. Obviously, translation has a lot of baggage when it comes to the Book of Mormon. I don't know if baggage is the right term. I don't mean that in a negative way, but it's really important when it comes to our engagement with the Book of Mormon. So did that feel like a heavy responsibility to sort of like take this text that is sacred to millions of people and in a way do your own translation of it? And how did you approach that responsibility?
Yeah, I'll just say I think it's a huge responsibility, and I don't think we ever wanted to claim to be the official word or something. We weren't trying to make like, this is the only way to use this story, right? Because these are stories, and when you read the story, it can speak to you in a way. And when we read this, that's fine. We're not trying to cut off all other possibilities that this text can be or could be used for in your life or could touch you in a certain way. Yeah. So we're not trying to be the be all, to that. But we did want to reach people and to reach towards God, right? And try to tell these stories in a way that felt true to us and true to the world and true to the God we know. I think that was our objective.
Yeah. We talk about in the introduction in that work we condensed all of our approach down to one line, which is these are real stories about a real God who loves real people. And I think that really was our guiding ethic throughout. It was just trying to make these stories feel real and like they were populated by real humans, messy humans. And I think from that determined a lot of the sort of takeaways or translations that we made.
I think whenever you're adapting a text, there's going to be translation. And I think sometimes we don't even realize it. There's sort of been sort of like accepted translation methods. Mm-hmm. Like, well, it's okay to do this kind of translation, like throwing in a Hebrew word or something, or feels like, oh yeah, that's totally fine. And other kinds, and oftentimes we segment things into chapters because they've been broken up that way for us, or even verses. But when you actually see them as stories, that segmentation gets changed. You see arcs, and you see the whole Book of Mormon as a story, and this section as a story, and how do they weave together? And that's all often ignored in these other kinds of translations, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just kind of what you privilege, what you focus on. And that, what Sarah said, was sort of the lens we chose, was these are real stories about a real God who loves real people. And that sort of became our guiding approach to how are we going to look at these stories. And then again, just stories. We're looking for stories. We're looking for plot lines and for arcs that are in the text. And when you break it up that way, I think these were sort of the stories that rose to the surface.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think one way that you sort of emphasize that point without even saying it explicitly is that you throw in these, what you call playful anachronisms. And that was such a gentle way to keep reminding the reader that this is a way to read the story. And what we're protecting here is the meaning. Here's the meat of the story. And all of these other things, there are going to be little additions to the story that aren't in the verse, but it's all in support of this line that this is a real God with real messy people. And so that made it so fun because it feels relatable. Every story feels relatable. And there are no villains or perfect heroes. Everybody is a little bit more complex. And I think that was part of what was especially powerful. And I notice in myself when I'm telling a story, I definitely feel this temptation to create real villains. Like, this is the bad guy and this is the good guy. And there's nothing complicated about it. They're just all good or all bad. And you just refuse to do that. And I think that was the most powerful thing again and again, because that's real life. Like, those are the conversations we're having about at school, that this kid isn't bad. This kid is scared. And it was so amazing how these stories that are so familiar to us kind of had this new light, and all of a sudden the villains became really complicated people that I know and I relate to and that I sometimes am. So I really love that. Would you just talk about your decision? Maybe you can, I don't know if there are some examples that come to mind, but talk about the traditional bad guys and how you tried to just sort of illuminate their humanity and complexity.
Yeah, I think it was a revelation, honestly. Doing this, it opened my eyes to some of these stories that are there in the text. Like, they exist there, but oftentimes with this tendency that we have and we've had to sort of turn it into like a good guy, villains, heroes, fairy tale sort of
totally
story.
Once upon a time.
Yeah, exactly. We sort of missed them, but I think the most maybe like obvious examples are the antichrists, right? Because those are the easiest ones to really turn into villains because they're sort of set up.
Because they're antichrist,
yeah,
which is, I think, literally the title of a horror movie, right?
Well, yeah, but it's like, I mean, they're set up as villains. But you take Sherem, and this is a fascinating story I think when you really look at it. Jacob pretty much comes up to Sherem and is like, you are completely wrong about everything, and it doesn't matter though, because you're never going to listen to me. I think the words we use in the text is like, you wouldn't believe me even if an angel blew a horn in your ear, right? But Sherem does. Sherem does ultimately believe and tells everyone that he was wrong. Mm-hmm. And that moment becomes obviously an important moment for Sherem, who dies. But Jacob is touched by this. And after that, in the book, we call it, he starts Project Love My Brother, which was, they sent missionaries to the Lamanites. So this is a moment that Jacob realized people can change. Right? He was like, wait, what? Sherem changed? And he just converted all these people? Like, Sherem did that. And then this is my own family that's living over there. We're calling them Lamanites. We think they're hopeless. Maybe they're not. And they start sending missionaries. And maybe he sent his own sons, right? That becomes relevant later. Yeah. We don't know, but we do know they sent missionaries. And I feel like that story became so much more real suddenly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the Book of Mormon is actually a really effective warning text against simplification and vilification and polarization and tribalism, because it doesn't turn out well for the Nephites, right? To vilify and to simplify who the Lamanites were. It begins pretty early on with the schism in the family and then escalates throughout the text until literally the entire Nephite civilization is annihilated. And so I think and I don't think that's actually unique to the Book of Mormon. That's a very human tendency. We want to protect our families against ideas and behaviors that we think are bad. And so we find emblematic people who are practicing those ideas or behaviors, and we say, well, they're bad, they're wrong for these reasons, and we should not be like them. And it puts distance between us, right? It says they are not us and we are not them, and that's good because we're not that, and that's good of us to not be that. Yeah. But I think the reality is, certainly in the Book of Mormon and in life as well, that all of the worst parts of those people are probably true of us too. And what makes us good, the best parts of us, are also probably true of them. And I think we felt the weight of that responsibility when we were writing about these characters, to try to make them full humans, to make them a little more full-bodied than they often are in sacrament meetings or in Sunday schools, and to show how the schism was actually working in a lived way, rather than in this sort of caricatured way that we often get.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Korihor is another example.
I was going to just ask you about Korihor. Yes, I love that one.
Okay, what do you love about it?
I love that I've always felt like I could dismiss him as an antichrist, and there was nothing complicated about that story. And the way you tell it, that like he was troubled that these people of God were preaching this prosperity gospel, basically. Like they were preaching that because they believed in God, they had everything they would ever need. And anyone who didn't must be bad in some way. And Korihor recognized that something was wrong. And it just made me realize that when you make a villain, then you can kind of dismiss all of their ideas. And what you write is that he was a little bit right and he was a little bit wrong. He went farther than what was right. But it would have been a much richer conversation for those people to be like, how is Korihor a little bit right? And let's like wrestle with these ideas instead of dismissing him and all of his ideas as a villain.
Yeah, I think it's part of just the chapterification of the Book of Mormon, but I think we tend to separate out the sermons and the stories. Yeah. And in reality, they inform each other all the time. And I think that Korihor is actually a great example where when you see Korihor in the context of the Zoramites, who he's apparently hanging out with, these are people standing on their Rameumptom and thanking God for making them so blessed and so righteous, and then like not allowing poor people to come into their church buildings. Suddenly Korihor starts to make a lot more sense where he was coming from and what shaped his ideas. And I think Alma's response to him also makes a lot more sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like a great example, like something I had no clue existed. Like I knew that he was like trampled on by the Zoramites, but I just had never made the connection until I was looking for real characters. And I was like, wait a second, what? Yeah. Of course he hated the idea of that prosperity gospel, as you called it, right? Like that rubbed him the wrong way. It would rub me the wrong way. Absolutely. If I was hanging out there, I'd be like, no, this is not true. You're just using this to bolster your own reputation, your own, like,
And it would be really hard to have then the president of the Nephite people, who was also the prophet, to come back and say, oh, you're wrong. It would be like, I think it would be hard to take that from that specific person.
Yeah. And then I think also it's really interesting to see his sort of curse also be seen as a blessing, right? Like he received an answer to his prayer, and ultimately he was killed for it, you know? And so I don't know, you kind of see these heroic moments in these people that we've just seen as villains, both Sherem and Korihor.
Yeah.
What's striking me right now is that these are really sort of non-dual takes that we have on a lot of these characters that even I think us as adults don't typically read into the scripture when we're just sort of giving it a superficial reading. And I'm wondering how much harder it is for kids, or maybe I'm looking at it completely the wrong way. But I'm curious if what the reaction of kids that you've read this with has been, or from parents who've read it to kids. Knowing that like this is a very mature way, I think, of looking at these stories, and not only atypical for kids, atypical for adults.
Yeah, so interesting, because like our son Clarence is like a stereotypical in this way. He'll like ask us, are they a good guy or a bad guy? Like, should I fight them with my sword? Yeah. So it's like so natural. And yet I think as we've read through this, and I don't think that's even bad. That's just developmental.
Normal.
But it's really interesting to see him grapple with it in really beautiful ways sometimes.
Yeah. So I was talking with Clarence recently, like a few weeks ago, and actually shortly after finishing the Book of Mormon Storybook, finishing writing it, this event happened in our lives that like wrecked our lives in a profound way, in ways that we're still grappling with. And there were individuals who were specifically involved with that. And Clarence was talking with me and he said, so Mom, we're supposed to have charity for everyone. And I have charity for the whole world. And I said, oh, really? Because, it's actually a lot easier to have charity for the whole world than it is to have charity for people you don't like. And he said, oh, like the people who made us so scared and sad. And I said, yeah, like them. I have a really hard time having charity for those people.
Yeah.
And he was grappling, and he said, but God probably loves them still, right? And he said, yeah, probably, bud. He said, well, maybe God can help me have charity for them, and then I can help you have charity.
Oh.
And it's so like simple and elementary in some ways, but I think also the real grappling with the lived experience that mirrors in some way this really, really painful episodes in the family of Lehi and Sariah, and trying to practice some of the same devilification and humanizing of people who caused a lot of harm.
Yeah. I want to talk about that more, because I think Laman and Lemuel are the ultimate caricatures of the Book of Mormon, right? They're the easiest to imitate and make fun of and call somebody out about. They're also, it felt like the lowest hanging fruit. They're the most relatable characters in some way. And it feels like when we characterize them always as just like the murmuring brothers, then I think we really lose so much of this opportunity to grow. And maybe it's in personal relationships, or it might just be in self-reflection. And you explicitly talk about Laman and Lemuel's fear and shame, and how this belief that they might not be good is debilitating in some ways. And it makes it really hard for them to be good. And that blew open that whole story for me. And it's just a totally different lens when you look at that story with this idea that this is what insecurity looks like. And we all relate to that so deeply. Everybody knows what that feels like. It just changes how important and heavy that story feels, and how relatable it is, not from like the heroic Nephi side, but from the weakness side. And that's probably more relatable than Nephi, who's always seems to be feeling very confident and like he knows exactly what he's supposed to do, and God's always talking to him. I don't think most people, I certainly don't relate to that actually, but I didn't realize how much I identified with the Laman and Lemuel side of that story until you wrote about it. So I'd love for you to do a reading if you'd be open to it.
I feel like we're not given that much interiority, right? In the Book of Mormon, we don't get that much of people's thoughts. And so that's probably the biggest amount of invention in this text, is we do add some interiority to try to tease out some of, these reasons for behavior. And that I think she'll probably read a section there where we get some of Laman and Lemuel's interiority. But I think it's true that they do have an arc, and they do have fear and anxiety. But I feel like looking at Nephi's story, you see him have it too. You see him go through a huge evolution from like this sort of young confidence of black and white, like a lot of people start out with, to something more complex, to ultimately his final plea where he claims that he believes that most people, if not all, right, will be saved in the kingdom of God.
Wow.
Like that's his ultimate sermon.
Yeah.
And he's praying for his people, and in his people includes
the Lamanites.
And
he prays for the Gentiles and for the Jews back in Jerusalem who had tried to kill his father. And
wow.
So I think he becomes more complex in his faith, much like his father was.
Yeah.
And you see that, I think you see a huge narrative with Nephi too, when you look at it as a story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll read this section. So this is from the chapter about getting the book from the super scary castle. And this Nephi is telling them that God had told them they have to go get the book. And this is Laman and Lemuel's response. But if God was talking to Nephi, then why is he not talking to us? Laman asked Lemuel. And this made them think of something that scared them even more. Perhaps God did not love them like he loved Nephi and Lehi. But why? What about them was not lovable? And then Laman and Lemuel shivered. Maybe, they thought, we are not good. Maybe we are bad. And from what you have heard so far, you might think that Laman and Lemuel were right. After all, hitting people with sticks is not very nice, and neither is complaining all the time. But you should know that they are God's children too, just like Nephi or Sam or me or you. And God loves them deeply because they are his. But Satan was whispering a lie into their ears. He was telling them, you are not good. And that lie went straight from their ears into their hearts, where it burned and stung them like an angry wasp every time their heart beat. Over and over their heart would drum the lie, you are not good, you are not good, you are not good. And Laman and Lemuel began to feel in their souls that they were not good, that they were bad, and that God did not love them because they were bad. And that made them very scared. Have you ever been so scared that you covered your eyes or hid under your blankets? That's what Laman and Lemuel were doing. They were scared and they hid themselves, but not just under their covers at night. All day long, they hid under their anger and their complaining and their mocking. They were so scared that they were bad. They didn't have any room to be happy or confident. And when you are always unhappy and unconfident, then it is hard to believe that you are good. And if you do not believe that you are good, it can be very hard to do good things. And it actually just struck me very recently that this section mirrors, in I think a really clear way, the fall, where Adam and Eve fell, and the serpent whispers in their ear, see, you are naked, go and hide. And I think that's a really fundamental experience of fallenness is shame and wanting to hide, and this feeling that we're inadequate and not good enough and not accepted. And so, I think we're sort of gesticulating a little bit at the interiority of Laman and Lemuel, but I think it tracks honestly with their experience of they had this father and this brother who were talking with God, who were seeing angels. And what were they doing? As the oldest brothers, as the inheritors of the birthright, what was going on?
Yeah, it certainly opens up the conversation. It's like it's just like a new level of likening. Like, how would this story make sense? And this is definitely a way that it works. There's in the same section, I hate talking about the story of Laban because I hate that story, but I do want to hear you talk about this, because this is another place where you add some a little bit of interiority, but also some imaginings about what maybe it was like for Nephi coming home after this whole event. And it just felt like such an interesting example of the way that you are wrestling with this complicated and kind of problematic story. And I thought it was so interesting. Like, I love that as a church community, we're still wrestling with this story. And I don't know that there's a right way. And I think that's what you were saying in your intro. Like, this isn't the only way to interpret it. Here's one way. And the thing that felt especially poignant to me is that Nephi returns, they have the book, and he just cries, like, in Sarai's shoulder. And like, I think because I hate that story, I just skip it. Like, I'd rather just not talk about it. And I liked that instead you really invite the reader to imagine what's the actual price of this story. Let's not like sensationalize it or even build Nephi up so it's this really heroic moment. He was so brave, and like try to strip it of what it really is. Instead, it felt like there was a little bit of reckoning that we're all invited into as a community. If we're gonna keep this story, then let's talk about the actual cost. Like, what would this actually feel like in a real family? And I still don't love the story, but I really appreciated this new way to wrestle with something so ugly. So I'm sure that was a lot of conversation between you. How do we deal with this story, and how do we deal with this message that we're giving explicitly to a child in the storybook?
Yeah, I actually wanted to skip it.
Really?
Not want to tell the story.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, let's jump in. Yeah, so Sarah was like, let's just, like, why would we tell that story? And I was like, well, I mean, what sort of how we were determining what to cover, sort of like what was important to the plot of the Book of Mormon, right? And I felt like this had resonances and importance, and we didn't want to sanitize things. We weren't trying to just create everything happy or not complex. We were trying to be complex and yet approachable and yet accessible. And so I think we can do it. I think there's a way to tell the story honestly and make it real and not just skip it over, because it's a real story that kids are going to hear. This story is going to come up. It's a big story. But I remember I was surprised. Oftentimes when you're writing a draft, you just sort of come to an ending, right? You just sort of like diving in. And I remember the moment that sort of the Christ connection in that story struck me. As we were coming to an ending, I realized Laban sort of is a mirror of Christ here, who gives up his life so that this other family has this richness, and the whole nation grows out of it. And then also the connections between Abraham and Isaac. There's really interesting connections and differences, because an angel comes and stops Abraham, and no angel comes for Nephi, right? He did the thing, he was faithful, he showed up, and no angel came. And that was another profound moment. It was like, wait, there should have been an angel. Why wasn't there an angel? To provide another way. And so I feel like it became a sacred story.
I was fascinated by your interpretation. I had never taken it that way, and I want to thank you for doing it so thoughtfully and heartfully. I'm curious if there was a draft version when you were working on this particular story where Nephi made the wrong choice. This is something Steve Peck, for instance, has written some really interesting fiction. In Heike's Void, I think, is particularly where this comes up, where Nephi, it's thousands of years after the fact, Nephi in the spirit world, realizing that what he sort of thought was the spirit was actually his own interpretation. Like, I was really upset. This guy took all our stuff, threatened our lives. And I kind of, maybe that voice in my head was actually just me being like, it's time to, take my revenge in a sense. And Nephi then in Steve's story, which is fictional, grapples with that as sort of his penance. Did you guys consider that at all?
Yeah, I think for sure. Yes. I think what we ultimately decided to do was, in some ways, zoom into the intimacy of the human grappling of the moment, but also in some ways zoom out, and talk about how, like, ultimately we don't know everything that went into this moment, but we do know that God is kind, that God is loving, and that this would have been so hard for Nephi and for his family. And so I think there was some sort of hedging or intentional ambiguity there, because I think it is such a difficult story that's, I think, should be left open to a lot of different possible readings.
Yeah. I think as we tell it, it's sort of through, in that moment, it's sort of through Nephi's lens. So it leaves open a lot of possibilities. But like you said, it's certain. You don't just kill someone and then go home and that's not how that works. That's if we're telling real stories about real people, that has an impact.
Yeah.
Let me ask about one other. I think the other most difficult story in the entire book is in 3 Nephi 9, the sort of precursor to Christ coming back, where these cities are destroyed. There's the big storm. You guys talk about how scary that is. In the Book of Mormon, the text itself, the voice of God claims responsibility for all of that destruction, and for killing what sounds like tens or hundreds of thousands of people, and also sort of like very explicitly sorts them into righteous and wicked. In your interpretation, the voice of God comes and does share that metaphor, the beautiful one about the hen gathering her chicks under her wings and all of that, doesn't explicitly claim doesn't explicitly claim responsibility for that destruction. How did you guys think about that one?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's such a great question. I mean, so when we were writing this, I was actively pursuing a PhD studying the Book of Job.
Yeah.
And I think that exact question comes up all the time in Job scholarship. And I think maybe part of the reason why we didn't include that was I didn't know a way to answer that for kids. To talk about that for kids. And so I think that's maybe a place where sort of the story or the interpretation or something comes short.
Yeah. Totally.
I was in the airport all day yesterday because we got delayed flights. And so I was writing, because we started the Book of Mormon, the Bible storybook. I was writing the story of Noah, and that's the same kind of story. Really just tough story to try to tell, with the idea that you have a loving God who loves his children. And how I told it so far, and this is the first draft, was very much that God had a perspective of suffering and death. And Noah's obedient follows along, but then Noah witnesses this destruction and the screaming, and there's dead bodies floating on the water for weeks after, and he's totally traumatized. And the last story we have of him is a drunkard, right? He's like drinking and he's naked. You have this man who's totally traumatized by these events. And I actually have, and I'm not sure if this is going to fit in, but I have God sort of learning a lesson. Like, it's true that death is not the end and that it's just a blip, but it's also terrible.
Mm.
And it's true that suffering is just a moment in eternity, but it's also true that it's its own eternity. And God had that awareness. And so he promises Noah, I will never do this again. And I didn't realize that the rainbow came later. I just assumed that was like right after the flood, but it's a while later. And I was like, I think God saw Noah be totally traumatized by this and was like, I'm never going to do this again.
Mm.
Wow.
I have a perspective, but it's different than yours. And that's real. What you're experiencing is real. And I don't know if God learns things or not. But again, this is a story, and these are humans trying to talk about God. And I think in the story, I think God learned a lesson.
Wow.
Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. I just keep thinking about a conversation we had with Jared Halverson a long time ago, and he talked about how he sees the scriptures as a catalyst, not just a catalog. And this to me feels like the most fruitful kind of conversation that we could be having about our shared canon, that, whether or not we come down on what is literally perfectly true and everyone should agree, there's so much growth that happens in the back and forth of trying to understand what it could mean. And that feels more true in a sense than mining down to the exact right interpretation. As a community, as a body of Christ, it feels like that's the most powerful, meaningful work that we could be engaging with together, with something that we share, with these valuable stories that we share. So thank you so much.
I love that term, catalyst, not catalog, because I think in a lot of ways, right, we're told to liken the scriptures. We're told, we're given explicit instructions to wrestle with them.
Yeah.
Right? Wrestle with these. And it's not just a list of things you're supposed to know. And again, that's back to it's not flashcards. This is an approach to God. This is an access point. And you're supposed to wrestle. You're supposed to, it's a catalyst. I love that.
Yeah, thank you. I noticed over and over that some of the classic, quote unquote, classic stories of the Book of Mormon are pretty violent, like Ammon and Abinadi, and those are the most visually alive stories. They're the ones that are the easiest to draw a picture of, and they're the easiest to tell. And so I was really surprised and delighted that somehow you were able to tell these stories in such an engaging way, but you didn't you didn't sensationalize the violence. You don't talk about Ammon in arms. You say, I think your phrase was, he fights off the enemies of the king, and Abinadi is killed, but there's not this sensationalizing of the details, which I'm realizing they're a distraction. It's the first thing that comes to mind when you say those names, and the stories were retold in a way that the actual meaning becomes the biggest part of the story, instead of these really sensationalized violent bits. So, but that feels like you would really have to exercise some restraint, because it's so much easier, it seems like, to tell the stories in the way that seems like the most attention grabbing for a kid. So can you just talk about that? That seemed like a really deliberate decision, and it did not seem like a trade-off. It really felt like the stories were still totally engaging and there was nothing lost. In fact, it reveals what's more meaningful about these stories.
Yeah. I think for sure. I mean, obviously, the Book of Mormon is frequently a really brutal text. There's a lot of violence. And I think it would be tempting or easy to sort of indulge in the decadence of that. But again, I think if we're going to have a guiding ethic of these are real people, then I think you have to be able to approach these as real people. And when you're talking about somebody cutting off arms, that feels like a caricature or a cartoon or something really fast.
Yeah.
And so I think we wanted to avoid that. But also, like you said, I think for us, it came down to, is this part of the story really important for understanding the story? And like with Ammon cutting off arms, it didn't feel necessary to what actually is the arc of the story.
Yeah, that violence plays no role in the story.
Right. In a way that like the annihilation of the Nephite people actually feels really important to be able to tell thoughtfully and well.
Yeah, I think there's this really difference between different moments of violence. And yeah, I mean, if you were to go into that arm thing, you could try to tell that real if it felt like it was worth the space and the story. But I just don't feel like that.
Yeah.
There wasn't much there to work with. And so it just wasn't important. But yeah, we really go into some moments of violence like Ammonihah, and those are crucial moments for the story. And characters were changed in those moments. And so we tell those stories.
Yeah, I loved your retelling of Ammonihah, and it's kind of what you were saying about Noah, that there's this realization that the Alma and Amulek both really have this like heartbreaking open moment, and I love how simply you put it, that like I think you're saying at the beginning that Alma says repent and no one listens, and then second he says okay, or else you'll burn in fire and brimstone, and then the end of the story, after all of the horrific things that he's seen, he never says fire again. And like I just really, who knows like if how that trauma would have played out in his life, but I love this idea that we have to kind of be introspective about that, and if that were true, like it makes you so reflective about your language and like the flippancy of dismissing an entire group of people because you think they're wrong. And like, that story just became, there was so much more gravity there when you imagine like that association for him would be enough to stop using language that was so violent.
Yeah, and that story actually was inspired by this incredible article I read from the Maxwell Institute.
I wondered, was it Kylie Turley that talks about is it Kylie Turley?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there actually is evidence that the usage of hellfire and brimstone, like, I mean, certainly Alma never uses it again. And also throughout the rest of the Book of Mormon, it decreases dramatically from the beginning of the Book of Mormon.
After Ammonihah.
Yeah. So I think there is actually
textual support.
It's not like highlighted, but textual support for the potential impact that this episode had in Alma and Alma's children, in their children, and for the rhetoric for the rest of the Book of Mormon as well.
Yeah.
Just like with Nephi, after the war start that Nephi mentions that people started using Lamanites and people started using Nephites, but he actually never uses them beyond saying other people are saying this.
And he actively resists that terminology.
And we see, and then he has all of these Isaiah chapters, many of them about reconciliation and about repentance. And then finally his final sermon of I really think it's possible that everybody could be saved. I really think I might see all of my brothers in heaven someday.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I'm curious, this is like what you're saying, Sarah, is bringing up for me, like having gone through the Book of Mormon in this particular way, like, reading it in stories, in arcs, and pulling out what it's really saying, and then likening it to yourselves or to your children, or for anybody. What is the Book of Mormon telling us in 2024 to you guys? Like, what should we get out of this book? And obviously there are a million things, but for you, like what came out of it?
Yeah, so it's one of those stories where it's a lot of stories inside of a story. Yeah. But there's the big story. Yeah. And they all sort of speak, there's echoes of that big story throughout. And it's a cautionary tale, right, of tribalism. There's the story of this family that splits apart. And that fracture continues throughout the entire story, ultimately to a tragic ending wherein one side of the family is completely wiped out. But that's not quite the end, right? We have Moroni who survives. Mm-hmm. And he has this sort of pen pal relationship with the people that are dead. He's reading these texts and having this relationship with the past and dialoguing with it. And then ultimately, he's reading his father's own writings, and their writings about hope. There was hope in these moments of tribalism, these moments of disaster, of like seeing the worst things you could imagine seeing. There's hope, and there's a future. And so Moroni takes these plates and buries them in Cumorah, which is where the battle took place. So in the place of failure, in the place of death, he buries this record, which becomes an embodiment of hope, right? And he plants it in the earth and testifies that someday this is going to come forth. And this story will be redeemed, and this family will be redeemed, and this hope will be realized. And that's the promise. And the embodiment of the Book of Mormon is that as bad as it seems, there's hope, and that we can heal our divides. We can get rid of the ites, this thing that we failed to do so many times. We can do it, and we will do it.
And our story will be part of it.
Yeah. Wow. And we're going to be part of that. We're going to be part of that redemption.
That's really incredible. I've never thought of that metaphor, like planting the gold plates, among all of this destruction as a seed, that will someday spring forth. And we are all part of that reconciliation that's happening. That's really beautiful.
Yeah. Can I read a little bit from this? So this is Moroni sort of at the end of his life. And he's talking about how he's about to bury the plates. And then he finds this letter from his father that he chooses to include. And his father's writing at the end of all things when people to become monsters and do horrible things. And he writes about love. So he says, the world has fallen. People I remember as children have become monsters. And there is nothing more terrible than seeing a child become a monster, because that is not supposed to happen. Children are meant to be angels. And you were my angel, Moroni. Ha ha ha.
The biggest pun in the book right there. You just got it. There it was. Our biggest pun. Anyways, that was pretty good. It was like, kill the moment. I think he thought we should take it out, but I was like, I just like it so much.
You, my beautiful boy, this is my final blessing to you. It is all I have left to give. You shall have hope. And I think that is sort of this like really surprising turn at the end of the Book of Mormon, where you get Mormon and you get even just a chapter before that where you see cannibalism and rape and every human atrocity that you can imagine or ideally not imagine, right? Mm-hmm. And then suddenly we're talking about charity and hope and love. And I think it's a surprising but right ending for this book.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Thank you so much. Are there characters that come to mind that you fell in love with during this process that maybe weren't quite so front and center for you before you wrote the storybook?
So I have two. One, I mean, it's always been a big story. I've always loved the anti-Nephite Lehis, but it wasn't until writing this book that I saw a real mirroring between them burying their weapons and them coming to the Nephites who they had been at war with, who they had killed, who they, there had been all kinds of horrible atrocities between the two of them, and saying, will you go to war for us? Will you die for us? Will you let us live among you and go to your church with you? And realizing that it was really then that the weapons were buried, and that new hope sprang up.
I think the line is in the text something like before they had to bury their weapons. They had
to bury their weapons, now they had to bury their pride. Yeah.
And before they had to face the wickedness of others, and here they had to face the wickedness in themselves. So this real beautiful moment
of reconciliation. That's so powerful, because I think it's sort of rare in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. And maybe we should read the end of that.
Yeah, I'll just say the other great achievement, unsung achievement of the Book of Mormon Storybook is that we got 2 stories out of the Book of Omni. And I actually love the Omni stories, especially the first one. I think is so sweet. We talk about literally one verse in the Book of Omni where he says, I think I'm not a very good person. And like the other people, they crossed an ocean, they had all of these incredible things happen, and here I am just living my life.
Not even very well. He feels like I'm kind of a bad guy.
That can be honestly very relatable.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, the conclusion of that story is just actually it was the unremarkableness of these lives that all of these different people writing in the margins and corners live is what is so remarkable. It's this remarkable moment where all of these past generations and all of these epic sagas made possible, right, for people to live beautifully boring lives, and for that to be enough.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
Can I ask you guys? Sorry, I have a couple other questions.
Okay, we got to do the reading.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when the anti-Nephi Lehis arrived in the Nephite kingdom, they threw themselves on the ground and they held the feet of the Nephites and they cried and cried. Can you ever forgive us? They asked. Can you ever be happy with us? And the Nephites also did something remarkable. They helped the anti-Nephi Lehis to their feet and looked straight into their eyes. My friends, we have all done wrong, but you are home now. Come live with us. Be our sister. Be our brother. And the Nephites helped them move into their new home. They brought their horses, their sheep, their clothing, their games, their toys, but they left behind two things buried deep in the earth. And where they are buried, there is a mound, and the mound is green now, soft with moss and grass. Trees have grown there so that it is shady and cool. They are tall trees with roots that grow deep into the earth and mingle with swords and arrows and axes and scimitars. And the roots are slow and strong, and whatever they wrap around, they dull, they bend, they break into dust. And the water washes it slowly, ever so slowly away. Maybe in another 1,000 years, there will be nothing left.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm curious. Thank you so much for that reading and just everything about the book. I don't want to not ask a question about the art. It's really, really beautiful and really different than the Book of Mormon stories that I grew up with. Could you talk about how this came to be? And who did it?
Yeah.
Sarah, you should talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually the Book of Mormon Storybook started as a weekly blog. And all of the images for that were provided by Lauren Blair, who is a collage artist. And she just brought so much love and imagination and creativity to this project. But eventually when we started turning this into a book, she actually had to step away. And so we knew we wanted to honor her legacy by continuing with the collage art style. And we were super, super lucky to find Maddie Baker. She's an illustration major out of BYU now. She's in grad school. And she just brought so much thought and tenderness and care to the imagery here. And every single week she would make multiple images that were really, really rich. All of these are handmade collage art images. And I think it just brings a real tenderness, but also a real sense of care to these stories. That these are compiled out of different pieces, carefully, bits at a time, into something really beautiful.
Yeah, we like that metaphor, just the collage nature of the book. So it fit with the artwork. And then it was interesting to see someone come in and identify a visual for a story. Yeah. Because we weren't telling her what to do. We sometimes brainstormed a little bit with her, but it was interesting to see like what she found in a story. Yeah. So that was an interesting experience, just to see her read a story and then find a visual representation.
Yeah. So for example, she early on, she said, I think we should do the Lamanites in cool colors and the Nephites in warm colors. And that continued throughout the book. And then in stories like the anti-Nephi Lehis, they actually start to mingle a little bit. The colors, there's some crossover in the colors.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And just like really gentle, thoughtful details like that, where Maddie brought so much to the team.
Yeah. How many unique pieces of art are there in the 2 volumes?
50.
So it's 50 stories. There's one art piece for each story.
It's really, really amazing. It's beautiful.
It sets the tone. It really sets the tone for the entire project. It's like a feeling. You feel what this will be.
Yeah. And I'll just say too about the book itself, like it's bound beautifully. There's embossing, like the whole thing just feels really good. And when this arrived in the mail, I was like, oh, this is a next level piece of art just by itself. Like if you're into interior design, definitely buy these and just use them somewhere.
An excellent coffee table book for sure.
It really is. And we
should have Marriott buy them and put in all the hotels.
I like that. Both volumes. I don't know if they'd fit in those little side like nightstand.
They'll look better than what they have now.
Yeah. That's awesome. The final question that I wanted to ask you guys is, and we'll definitely mention in the show notes, maybe in the intro, like some of the other creative work that you guys are doing. It's amazing to me that you've done so much more than just this, because this is monumental by itself. But your filmmakers, your writers, you have a ton of stuff going. For people like me who see this and are inspired and want to be more creative, like what do you suggest? Like how do you work and how do you get going on things like this?
Something that I struggle with, but I think that is really helpful, is just having a sort of humble confidence when you approach these projects. It takes some chutzpah to get started and to do something that you really have a vision for and that you really think should be in the world. And knowing that not everybody will love it and people will disagree with it. Certainly people have had theological or stylistic disagreements with this project. But just trusting that this is something that can exist anyway, and that you can do well.
Like in our relationship, I feel like I tend to be the more just naturally confident, or maybe a little less just like
pragmatic.
I got it. It's right. Did it. Anyways, and so I feel like I had to I told you, just edit. Don't make a comment. You just got to go in and edit. Like I trust Sarah. I was like, I would just say anyone like just edit. But with Sarah, it was like, no, like just make the edit. Like you got to just go forward and make the edit. And so that's what we started doing. It was like, we have one draft. We're not having like a million separate drafts. Yeah. Like you're just making the edit on that copy and we're just going to keep moving forward. And that's, I guess, a specific example of just sort of that. Yeah. Got to have confidence and do it. Just do it and go forward.
I feel like we are so comfortable with worship that looks kind of heady, like it's very in our mind. And I really love the idea that creativity can be a really dependable pathway to connect with God. And so I'm curious, like how you look at these projects that you've been working on and how you look at the way you intentionally connect with God. Is there crossover? Like, are you doing creative things to feel like you're connecting with heavenly parents? Or does your private worship look very different than these creative things that you focus on?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, so something Josh's dad says all the time actually is good writing is good thinking.
I was going to say that.
Wow.
You shouldn't offer for her to go first.
I know.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's certainly been true of this project is sitting with these stories and trying to write out how I experienced God in them and how I think maybe the people in them experienced God has certainly been a sort of process of, I think I would say worship. Of coming to God and holding bits and pieces of ideas together and saying, what do you think? What do we do with these?
Yeah, and I think I mostly agree with my dad about that. I'm not totally on board. There's more to writing than just, it's not like analytical is not the whole thing. There's something very creative and a different sort of approach. You're just sort of throwing something out there and it's like echoes and hearing what comes back, what bumps up. Like there's something else going on, not just thinking, something intuitive.
Yes.
That's in process. So they're certainly not separated for me, like the creative and the analytical. They're very, I think it's almost, I don't know, maybe people experience it that way, but I definitely don't. All of my best writing, I think begins as an exploration and as very much an intuitive sort of reaching. It's like, I feel like there's something here. Wow. I pursue it. And then a lot of it gets good after I edit it, which is maybe more on the analytical. And it's like, they're intertwined. I don't feel like they separate into a clean dichotomy at all. But I'll say that for me, certainly my most regular spiritual experiences are writing. You write something and then you read it. And that's when I cry. Right. That first reading, probably after that I'm okay. But like, I just think that's like, or church talk or anything, like you try to write something beautiful and meaningful, and it just allows you to do this sort of long form thinking, which is really hard to do in your head until you get committed to paper. You can sort of explore and do a certain kind of thinking, but there's a long form connective work that happens in putting things together and presenting it. And that becomes sort of this catharsis or this moment of like communion, and you feel it really profoundly. And I think that's probably my most regular spiritual experience.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for sharing. That resonates so deeply with me. But I don't think I've ever really articulated that there is this process of opening and then refining and opening and refining. And it feels like that's a way that God really can enter in. And maybe it takes the work where we really put something black and white on paper and like commit to saying words. And that's hard. It's hard to go all in and then trust that process that you'll be able to refine it and find something that feels deeply true. So thank you for putting that out there. I really love it. Any other closing thoughts before we wrap up that you want to make sure to mention?
Well, maybe, so this is relevant to a previous question for which I apologize, but I think it's actually maybe interesting just to know like more specifically how this book started. We were sitting in a sacrament meeting and somebody was giving a talk and they were talking about the family of Lehi and Sariah. And I was feeling frustrated with the talk. And I like wrote out a few paragraphs about Laman and Lemuel, and that turned into the paragraphs that I read. And I read them to Josh after church, and he said, you know what? Like, I think we should do this. like we could really do this, and I think we should, because I don't think that this exists yet.
Yeah. That was the
origin. That was how it started.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
Yeah, it was actually trying to humanize Laman and Lemuel was the beginning of the Book of Mormon Storybook.
You listened today to the beginning. She read that in sacrament.
Being disturbed in a sacrament was this. Wow.
Yeah. So it was like I said, humanizing Laman and Lemuel is actually where all of this sort of began.
Yeah, I'll just end by saying it was I think I went in thinking that I kind of knew the stories, right? Because I read it a bunch on my mission and since and before, and like I know the stories. But when you actually go in looking for stories, right, for through lines, for arcs, completely changed. Like it opened up the stories in a whole new way, in a profound way, and I sincerely loved the book. You know, I think I was telling you before jokingly that my brother falls asleep most nights listening to this book. And I sit with my son and we listen to it normally right before bed, at least one chapter. And sometimes I just want to stay for two because I just really like it. Like it's just really, it's a beautiful experience even now for me to listen to these stories.
Yeah. And I would say you find stories, but also I think I've been most surprised by finding people, like real people that I connect with in surprising ways that I hadn't anticipated before. Rather than finding heroes or legends, you find people.
Thank you so much. That's definitely been our experience. So we feel so much gratitude to you both for this project.
It's amazing, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Josh and Sarah Sabey. You can find the Book of Mormon Storybook for Little Saints at forlittlesaints.com and on Audible. And if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. We read all of the reviews and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and remember you can check out more at faithmatters.org.